Have you ever watched someone slowly become a shell of who they used to be? Not because of one traumatic event, but because of 1,000 small moments that stacked on top of each other until the person they were just disappeared. I'm talking about the guy who used to speak his mind freely, but now carefully measures every word. The one who laughed loudly without worrying what anyone thought, but now stays quiet in rooms full of people. The man who had dreams and opinions and a natural confidence, but now asks permission before making basic decisions about his own life. It usually starts with something that seems completely harmless. Maybe it's a misunderstanding about weekend plans, or something that got forgotten, or a comment that landed the wrong way. Nothing serious. Nothing that should matter in the grand scheme of a relationship that's supposed to mean everything. But instead of having a real conversation about it, one person gets frustrated and the other person decides that making waves isn't worth it. So they drop it. They let it go. They tell themselves it's not that big of a deal. Here's the thing though. That moment, that single moment where someone decides to swallow their own perspective instead of expressing it honestly, that's not peace. That's the beginning of something else entirely. And most people don't realize what they've started. Picture this scenario happening repeatedly. Maybe a woman has a frustrating day at work. She comes home and snaps at her partner over something incredibly small, like the way he loaded the dishwasher or how he answered a simple question. Her tone is sharp. Her words carry an edge. And in that moment, instead of saying, "Hey, I notice you're frustrated and that's okay, but I'm not comfortable with how you're talking to me right now," he does something different. He becomes a problem solver. He immediately starts trying to make her feel better. He asks her about her day. He offers to get takeout from her favorite restaurant. He becomes softer, more accommodating, more willing to absorb her frustration rather than simply acknowledge it happened. Now, is he being cruel? Absolutely not. Is he being unkind? No. By most definitions, what he's doing looks like support. It looks like emotional intelligence. It looks like the kind of thing relationship advice tells you to do. But here's what happens when this response becomes the pattern instead of the rare exception. The brain is an incredibly smart organ. It doesn't just process individual moments, it processes trends, it recognizes patterns. And when the same sequence of events happens over and over, the brain starts to assume that's how things work now. That's normal. That's what this relationship is. So the woman's brain, without her even consciously realizing it, begins learning something very specific. When I'm frustrated, I can express that frustration directly toward this person. When I'm short or critical or sarcastic, nothing actually challenges me. He apologizes even when he hasn't done anything wrong. He tries to make me feel better. He works to solve my problems. The conversation moves on. There are no actual consequences for the way I'm speaking. And at the exact same time, the man's brain is learning something equally damaging. When she's upset with me, my job is to fix it. When there's tension, I should make it disappear. My own feelings about how I'm being treated don't matter as much as keeping the peace. Every time I stay silent, I protect the relationship. Every time I speak up, I risk making things worse. Neither of them made a conscious choice to teach each other these lessons, but they're teaching them anyway, every single day. Most people think relationships fail because of one moment, one huge argument, one terrible betrayal, one moment where everything explodes and can't be put back together. But that's rarely how it actually happens. Relationships usually die from 1,000 paper cuts, not one fatal wound. And the paper cuts come from the same source over and over until both people stop even noticing they're being cut anymore. Let me tell you what happens underneath the surface during this process, because this is the part most people never think about. Respect is like trust in a relationship. It doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes, it fades, it dies through repetition. When someone behaves in a certain way and nothing challenges that behavior, when they speak harshly and the other person simply absorbs it and moves on, something shifts in how they see each other. The woman might not consciously think, I don't respect him anymore, but she starts to notice that he never stands up for himself. He never pushes back. He never says no. He adapts to whatever mood she's in. And sometimes, without her meaning to, without her even realizing it's happening, she starts seeing him as less than he was before. At the same time, the man might not consciously think, I'm losing respect for myself, but he starts to notice that he's not being treated the way he knows he should be treated. He's not saying the things he actually thinks. He's not living the way he actually wants to live. He's living a version of himself that's specifically designed to not upset the other person. And that version of him, that diminished version, that person who's constantly trying to manage someone else's emotions and expectations, that person loses confidence in who he actually is. This is where the real damage happens. It's not the harsh words. It's not even the arguments. The real damage is this slow, quiet evaporation of respect from both directions. When respect starts disappearing, everything else changes too. Conversations that used to feel warm and easy now feel careful. There's an undercurrent of tension underneath everything. A simple question about dinner plans becomes fraught with potential conflict. A comment about something someone did gets interpreted as criticism rather than a neutral observation. The sarcasm starts increasing, the criticism becomes more frequent. What used to be occasional frustration becomes the baseline of how they interact with each other every single day. And here's the part that makes this pattern so difficult to break. The part that keeps it going long after both people have stopped enjoying the relationship. Once the pattern is established, it becomes self-reinforcing. The woman gets frustrated more easily because the underlying respect and warmth have eroded. The man becomes more careful and withdrawn because he's spent so long managing conflict. The woman interprets his withdrawal as him being cold or uncaring. The man interprets her frustration as her becoming meaner. They're both reacting to a dance they created together without ever consciously deciding to choreograph it. And most of the time, neither of them even realizes that's what's happening. They just think the other person has changed. They think they've become different. They wonder when things got so hard. The thing that makes this pattern so destructive is that it teaches both people to ignore the most important signal a relationship needs to pay attention to. It teaches them to ignore the signals that something isn't working. Because what usually happens is that the person who's behaving badly, the person whose frustration is being consistently absorbed without consequence, they stop noticing that they're behaving badly at all. It just becomes normal. This is how I communicate now. This is what this relationship is. And the person who's accepting the bad behavior, the person who's swallowing their own needs in exchange for peace, they also stop seeing it clearly. They've adapted so completely to walking on eggshells that the eggshells start to feel like a normal floor. I want to talk about something that happens next that I think is really important, and it's something that most men don't see coming. After months or years of this pattern, after constantly absorbing disrespect and refusing to set boundaries, most men make a critical mistake. They start trying even harder. They believe that if they just become more patient, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice their own needs, eventually things will get better. They think if they give more, if they become more accommodating, if they bend further, eventually the other person will see how much they love them and will start treating them better in return. It's such an understandable impulse, but it almost always makes everything worse. Because here's what that teaches the other person, not in words, but through actions. It teaches them that no matter how they behave, no matter what they do or how they speak, the other person will still be there, still trying, still accommodating, still giving. And as counterintuitive as it sounds, that doesn't create more affection. It doesn't create more love. It often creates the opposite. There's a principle in psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It basically says that when you reward a behavior, sometimes but not always, the behavior becomes even more ingrained, even more powerful. But when you reward a behavior every single time without fail, something else happens. The behavior becomes less special. It becomes expected. It becomes what you now have to give just to maintain the status quo. So a man who's constantly apologizing, even when he hasn't done anything wrong, who's constantly trying to smooth things over, who's constantly accommodating, he's accidentally taught his partner that this is just baseline. This is what she gets. This is what she can expect. And expectations are dangerous in relationships because once they're set, they become the foundation for everything that comes next. Let me paint you a more specific picture of what this looks like when it's happening. A man comes home from work. Before he even walks through the door, he's already thinking about what kind of mood he's going to encounter. He's running through conversations in his head, trying to anticipate what might upset the other person so he can avoid it. He doesn't just walk in and be himself. He walks in and he auditions for a version of himself that seems safe. He gives a greeting, and depending on how it's received, he knows what the next few hours are going to look like. If she's short with him, his entire evening becomes about trying to fix that. If she's sarcastic, he interprets that as a sign that he's done something wrong, even though nothing has happened. If she wants to talk about something that's bothering her, instead of listening from a place of partnership, he's already in fix-it mode, trying to solve it so that the problem and her frustration with it will both disappear. This is exhausting, not for an evening or a week, but for months or years or sometimes for entire relationships. Imagine being in a constant state of anticipation. Imagine having to read the room before you can be yourself in that room. Imagine never being able to just relax at home because home is where the most careful performance of your life is always happening. This isn't love. I want to be really clear about that. Love doesn't require someone to abandon themselves in order to keep another person content. Real love creates safety, not vigilance. Real love allows you to be yourself, not a carefully curated version of yourself that's designed to not upset anyone. And the tragedy of this pattern is that by the time most men realize what's happened, they've already spent so much time in this diminished version of themselves that they've stopped knowing who they actually are. The confident man they used to be feels like a distant memory. The person who spoke their mind feels like someone else. The person who could make decisions without asking permission seems like a different person entirely. And in a way, he is. Because you are literally what you practice. You become the man you act like every single day. So if every single day you're swallowing your own thoughts, managing someone else's emotions, refusing to rock the boat, you don't just become a man who does those things. You become a man who sees himself as someone who does those things. You become someone who's lost touch with his own foundation. This is the hidden cost of constant accommodation. It's not just that the relationship suffers, it's that you suffer. Your confidence suffers. Your sense of self suffers. Your ability to trust your own judgment suffers. And by the time you fully realize what's happened, you're not just fighting to change the relationship. You're fighting to remember who you were. Now, I know what some people are thinking right now. They're thinking, well, the answer must be to blow up, to stand up and fight back, to finally let all of this out and show the other person how wrong they've been. I understand that impulse. After months or years of swallowing your own voice, the idea of finally expressing it all can feel like justice, like reclaiming yourself. But that's not actually what happens. What happens is you create a different kind of destruction because there's a massive difference between setting a healthy boundary and exploding in anger. There's a difference between calmly addressing a pattern and finally unleashing all the anger you've been holding. And most of the time, when a man goes from being completely accommodating to being angry and reactive, the other person doesn't see growth. They see proof that they were right to feel frustrated with him all along. They see evidence that he's the problem. The thing about boundaries is that they have to be created in a very specific way to actually work. They can't come from anger or frustration or finally deciding you've had enough. Real boundaries come from clarity. They come from a place of understanding exactly what you will and won't accept, and then holding that line consistently. So when your partner speaks to you in a way that's disrespectful, the response isn't to immediately try to fix whatever's wrong or to finally blow up and unleash months of accumulated frustration. The response is something much simpler and much harder. It's to calmly acknowledge what just happened. You might say something like, "I want to talk about this, but I'm not willing to do it with this tone." Or, "I understand you're upset about something, but I'm not the right target for this frustration." Simple, clear, not accusatory, not attacking, just a statement about what you will and won't participate in. The first time you do this, it's going to feel uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, because you're used to the old pattern. You're used to immediately smoothing things over. You're used to absorbing it. So saying something simple and direct is going to feel like you're being harsh or cold or breaking the relationship. That's because your entire nervous system has been trained to expect that pattern. Your brain has learned that the solution to conflict is accommodation. So anything else is going to feel wrong. But here's what's actually happening. You're not being harsh. You're not breaking the relationship. You're finally giving the relationship a chance to be something different. You're introducing a variable into a pattern that's been stuck in a loop. And the moment you do that, everything has to change, because the equation is no longer the same. Now, I want to be really honest about what happens next, because this is where a lot of men give up. When you first start setting boundaries, the other person doesn't usually say, "Oh, wow, thank you for that. I'm so glad you're standing up for yourself now." That's not the typical response. The typical response is that things get a little worse before they get better. The other person might become more frustrated. They might argue that you're being different or cold, or that you're the one causing problems now. They might say you've changed, that you're no longer the person they fell in love with. And that's where the temptation is greatest. That's where you want to fall back into the old pattern, because at least the old pattern was familiar. At least you knew how to survive that. But if you go back now, if you return to absorbing disrespect, then nothing has changed. You've just taught both of you that if you push hard enough, if you complain enough, the other person will return to the pattern, and you're right back where you started. Real change in a relationship requires consistency. It requires doing something different, not once or twice, but over and over again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the other person is pushing back, even when it would be easier to just return to what was familiar. Here's something I think is really important to understand. Setting a boundary doesn't mean being mean. It doesn't mean being controlling. It doesn't mean trying to force the other person to change. What it means is that you're finally being clear about what you're willing to participate in and what you're not. And sometimes that creates healthier communication between both people. And sometimes it exposes the fact that the relationship was never actually healthy to begin with. But either way, you're no longer operating under an illusion. You're dealing with reality. One mistake men often make at this point is believing that their job is to change the other person. It's not. You can't change anyone but yourself. You can't make someone more respectful or more patient or more emotionally mature just because you want them to be. But what you can do is change what you accept. And that's actually more powerful than most people realize. Think about it this way. You are responsible for the standard you set in this relationship. Every time you accept disrespect, you're saying that's acceptable. Every time you immediately apologize for something that's not your fault, you're teaching the other person that's how disagreements will be resolved. Every time you absorb someone's frustration without expressing that it bothered you, you're communicating that this is how we handle conflict. Those things might seem small individually, but they are incredibly powerful in aggregate. The reason personal responsibility is so important here is that it gives you back your power. Instead of thinking, why is she treating me this way, which makes you a victim waiting for the other person to change, you can ask, what am I allowing? What standard have I set? What have I been teaching through my responses? And suddenly, you're not powerless anymore. Suddenly, you have agency. I want to talk about what usually happens after a man finally stops participating in an unhealthy pattern. And it's different for different relationships, but there's usually a process. At first, things might actually feel worse. The other person might push harder against the boundary because that's what they've learned to do. If they push hard enough, if they get frustrated enough, the other person will give in. So they're going to test it. They're going to push against it repeatedly. This is a normal part of the process. It doesn't mean the boundary isn't working. It actually means it is working because it's creating a consequence for a behavior that previously had none. Then, over time, usually over weeks or months, one of two things happens. Either the other person adapts to the new pattern and the relationship begins to shift into something healthier, or the relationship continues to deteriorate because both people can't figure out how to be together in a healthier way. And honestly, sometimes that's what needs to happen. Sometimes a relationship isn't salvageable, and that's okay. That's actually information you need to have. But the important thing is that you're no longer in a holding pattern, constantly trying to make something work that's fundamentally broken. You're dealing with reality. And dealing with reality, even when the reality is difficult, is always better than existing in an illusion. There's something else that changes too. When you finally stop accepting disrespect, your own confidence starts to return. Not immediately, but gradually. Because every time you set a boundary and hold it, you're giving yourself evidence that you value yourself. You're practicing self-respect. And self-respect, like any other skill, becomes stronger the more you practice it. The man who was asking permission before making decisions starts making decisions again. The man who was walking on eggshells starts walking normally. The man who had lost touch with his own thoughts starts thinking again. And here's something beautiful that sometimes happens. Sometimes the other person notices that change too. They notice that you're more confident, that you seem more like yourself. And sometimes that actually makes them want to respect you more. Because respect, real respect, doesn't come from someone being accommodating to you. It comes from seeing someone who knows their own value, who's willing to stand for it, and who isn't willing to compromise that in order to be liked. I want to leave you with something as we wrap this up. A lot of people hear information like this and they think, okay, so I need to be more aggressive, I need to be more assertive, I need to start fighting back. But that's not what any of this is about. This is actually about something much quieter and much more difficult. It's about having enough self-respect to stop participating in a dynamic that's hurting you. It's about being kind to yourself the way you've been kind to everyone else. Most of the time, the men who find themselves in these situations, they're good men. They care about relationships. They want things to work. They believe in loyalty and commitment and doing whatever it takes to make something work. Those aren't bad qualities. The problem isn't that they care too much. The problem is that they've learned to care about the relationship more than they care about themselves. And that imbalance is what creates the dysfunction. Here's what I think is important to understand. You can be a kind person and still have boundaries. You can be patient and still be firm about what you won't accept. You can love someone and still respect yourself enough to not participate in a dynamic that's hurting you. These things aren't contradictory. In fact, they're required for a healthy relationship. If you're in a situation where you're constantly accommodating, constantly smoothing things over, constantly swallowing your own voice, please hear this. It's not too late to change. It won't be easy. It will probably be uncomfortable. The other person might resist. Things might get worse before they get better, but it's possible. And you deserve to have a relationship where you don't have to abandon yourself in order to be loved. Because at the end of the day, the only relationship that's actually worth saving is one where both people are willing to show up as themselves, where both people's voices matter, and where respect flows in both directions. That's what you should be aiming for. That's what you deserve.